Welcome to Peggy's Recovery Corner. We are back today, and I have a very special guest. His name is David Vanderveld. I just want to make sure I'm pronouncing your last name correctly. Right? Okay, good. And he is the founder of Awakening, correct? Am I right? Am I saying it right?
Co-founder, yeah.
Co-founder, okay. And we'll get into all that. Awakening is a structured sober living nonprofit that's based out of Los Angeles. But first and foremost, I want to learn about David, you yourself. Who are you? Where were you born? Where were you raised? We can get into all the nitty gritty, all the other stuff afterwards, and then we'll work our way up to the recovery process. So who are you, David?
All right. I was born and raised in Los Angeles. I initially was brought up in Brentwood and then moved to the Valley briefly because of busing.
Mm-hmm.
And then ended up moving back to Santa Monica, where I graduated Santa Monica High School in 86. Mm-hmm. And then a series of things happened. Went up to college in Northern California, and so apparently Siri wants to get involved in this podcast.
Probably heard you say something that sounded like Siri.
So I went off to college in Northern California, and then drove cross country to New York and ended up getting sober in New York, although I was introduced to AA, 12-step program.
I mean, you can say whatever
Los
you want.
Angeles.
That's on you, yes.
I try to stay with the traditions as much as possible.
Right.
So, it's hard to talk about my upbringing without talking about my addiction and alcoholism. I got sober when I was 19, so it played a big part in my early life and also the last 33 years of being in 12-step abstinence-based recovery myself.
Mm-hmm.
So I grew up in Los Angeles, and my parents got divorced when I was about five and a half. It was a challenging home life in those first 5 years because my parents were married for 16 years and I got the last 6 years of that. And it wasn't a pleasant experience for them, I think, the last 6 years, and it certainly wasn't for me either. Mm-hmm. And then after that, it was in the middle of the busing situation. So I ended up going through the busing situation and my mom wanting to move me around to places where I could have the best public school experience possible. I ended up going to 6 different elementary schools, which was a little bit traumatic just because you don't establish any relationships. And I was an only child and I was adopted. So I think all those things contributed to issues that I had later in life. Mm-hmm. And, but none of that made me an alcoholic, or a drug addict. It was just stuff that happened. Sure. And, I probably started drinking and using when I was about 12. I had experimented with other things.
That's like the typical common age that a lot of people start, like really getting into.
Yeah. As soon as I realized the effect that it had, I wanted to do it pretty much every day, all day. It's interesting. I hear people talk about, social drinking or social drug use. Right. I mean, for me, because I started so early, there really was never that. It was always me wanting to be completely unconscious,
blasted,
and not present.
Right.
Always.
Yeah, sure.
And I took whatever I could to make that happen. It was primarily alcohol and whatever pills I could find initially, and then it graduated into crack cocaine and vodka, which are the two things that took me down eventually. So
crack cocaine. I mean, typically like we start with alcohol and sure some weed or something like that, but crack. Like you come from a pretty good family. Like, were you in an area where crack was running rampant, or did somebody turn you on to crack? Like, how'd that happen?
Interestingly, a friend of mine, Frank, we went to his sister's apartment, and I was at Samo High at the time, mm-hmm. and she was doing crack, and it looked interesting. I mean, before that, I had, I'd snorted cocaine, I had drank a lot of alcohol, and pot, had smoked pot and taken a lot of pills, but, crack cocaine was new to me, but it was the 80s. It was like, 84, 85, 86. So crack
Yes.
was pretty out there at the time,
Mm-hmm.
sort of in the same way that, opiates are and meth now. And so and the minute I took that hit off that crack pipe, like I knew I was going to do that as often as possible for the rest of my life.
Yeah. Because the shit captivates you. It really captivates you. Like once you get that hit and that flavor and that feeling that it gives you, it's just not enough. Like you got to keep getting more and more and more of it.
I mean, I don't think I was ever able to recapture that first experience the rest of the time I did, but I certainly tried and, stole and cheated and did everything I could as a teenager to be able to continue to support my habit.
And how old were you when that happened? Do you think about like 15, 16 years old?
The crack being introduced was probably 16.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, about 16.
But you said that you
into
had done
17.
You said you'd done cocaine before that. Like, was it commonly used in your friend circle? People were just doing coke? Because like a lot of 16-year-olds don't really know about coke or crack. I mean, I did crack at 16 myself too, and coke. But there was somebody that I knew whose family member was into that, so we had gotten it like that. How were you doing coke already so young?
I mean, I was going to parties in Santa Monica and Malibu, and there was all kinds of things there.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
And so there was alcohol, there was pot, there was cocaine. I mean, there was pills. There was pretty much anything you wanted, you could get in the weekend, social scene on the West Side in the 80s. And so, yeah, that's pretty much how it started. But I always did all of those things alcoholically, I would say. There was never there was no invisible line for me that I crossed. Like the first time for me was crossing the invisible line. I was 12. I went to my mom's friend's wedding at what was then the Sunset Marquee. And I started out in that room and then went from room to room to room, this little 12-year-old in tuxedo. And I just kept drinking. And then I blacked out, ended up throwing up in my bedroom and, couldn't wait to do it again the next time. So from the very get-go, it was alcoholic, drinking and eventually using.
Right. So what about hallucinogens? Did you experiment with any of that in your adolescent period?
So when I went off to college, which was in Northern California, pot was very prevalent, and so were mushrooms and acid. And so I did acid once. It was, and I did ecstasy up there as well. So yeah, I did all that. I wasn't really a hallucinogen person. I really wanted to be up or down. And so for me, I did stuff to get me up and then I did stuff to bring me down. But the idea of being completely out of control in the way that hallucinogens did, that made me uncomfortable because I was very controlling.
Okay. So you said you went up to college. Did you complete college, or did the drugs and alcohol get in the way of things?
The latter. I mean, there's no way. I mean, I could, what I did and how I thought and how I acted, college was not a great environment for me. And when I was up in college, I ended up borrowing a friend's half-ton truck and getting in a 5-car accident where I didn't quite make it out onto the main road, thank God. But I did.
What were you on? Were you drinking?
I believe I was just drinking. And I was so drunk that they wanted to leave me on campus. And they all went off to this bar. And I didn't like that they left me there. And so I borrowed my friend's truck to go meet them. And like I said, I never quite made it off campus and popped all 4 tires, cracked the axle, side swipe, backed into cars. There were 5 cars with a lot of damage by the time. And then I ran away from the scene and the security had to tackle me to the ground and then took me into the police station, which is where they UA'd me, which was like 2.5 hours later. And I still blew a .23. And so, I'm sure I was well over 0.3 when I was driving, which, I could have really hurt somebody. I'm grateful
Sure.
that didn't happen. But
that's very
after,
drunk. Very drunk.
yeah. So after that, I lasted one more semester and decided that probably I wasn't going to be asked to come back the next time. And as a consequence of that DUI, I ended up going to some AA meetings. And it was interesting. I was 17. No, I was 18. I was 18 when that happened, and I just turned 19 and it was back in Los Angeles for the summer and had to go to 12 AA meetings. And so as a part of the DUI thing. And I was like, okay, I'll do 12 in a row and just be done with it so I can enjoy the rest of my summer. And from the first time I went to a 12-step meeting, I have to say, I knew immediately that I was an alcoholic. And I think because it was the late 80s, I didn't have a lot of exposure to recovery. It's not all over the place like it is now in terms of consciousness. Mm-hmm. And so for me, I never really considered the idea that I was an alcoholic. I really just did what I did, thought I was insane, had a lot of blame game stuff going on, and taking no responsibility for what was happening to me. And so when I went and got a sponsor and started working the steps, it really started to stir things up in me that I had never let come to the surface ever. Because if I ever had an extreme positive feeling or extreme negative feeling, like I was putting something in me to escape. And so when I got sober that first time, all kinds of stuff started to come to the surface. And I decided to start acting out in ways that got me in a lot of trouble. So, and that was where I think the darkest part of my drinking and using happened. I stayed sober for about 6 months. But in the process of staying sober, I really engaged in some very, very unsober behavior. And a lot of it was about my sexuality emerging, because I'm a gay man. And I, didn't know anything about that, didn't understand it. Sure. Ended up getting involved with a IV drug using prostitute porn star person that I thought I was in love with, but we really just had intense drug addiction in common. And I ended up getting involved in prostitution sober. And then finally on New Year's Eve, ended up drinking again. And we ended up, drinking and using across country to Washington, D.C. We got in a fight. I ended up flying up to New York City and had a very drug-induced crack cocaine and alcohol week in a hotel on 42nd and 9th Avenue, which was the Milford Plaza Hotel. And back then there wasn't all this Disney, Times Square stuff. It was a seedy, gnarly area. And I was arguing with drug dealers in an alley about the quality of the crack they were trying to sell me. They were laughing at me, this crazy 18-year-old white boy, arguing about the quality. Anyway, they ended up giving it to me because they were just shocked. They just laughed at me. They're like, we could kill you, but you're just crazy. Yes. And I was.
Not even worth it.
And then I ended up going to AA, and I was like 145 pounds when I
This is in New York when you started going to AA
New York.
Out there? Yeah.
Yep. And I was in a meeting and with the person that I was with, and I ended up getting sober. They didn't. They ended up dying 2.5 years later. And, and I ended up staying sober. And, I was definitely sicker than most. It's interesting now, running Awakening Recovery, because when I got sober in New York in '88, it was at the very peak of the AIDS crisis. And people were dying all the time. I went to 17 funerals my first 2 years of sobriety, and we would take meetings to people in hospital rooms, and it was very intense and traumatic in hindsight. But it also was things where I saw the magic of people wanting to die sober, in hospital rooms with loving people in 12-step programs surrounding them and bringing meetings to them, and it was really it affected my recovery in a very profound way.
I love that.
And I was insane. So I was going to like 2 to 4 meetings a day. The hardest thing about staying sober was staying sober in between the meetings. So I would do fellowship all the time, but I couldn't get to sleep before 2 or 3 in the morning because of my drug use and my alcoholism. And then I would get up around 10. I would go to a noon meeting. Then I would go to 6 o'clock meeting, 10 o'clock meeting, and then Midnight Madness in Times Square at the time. And that was my routine most days. And I ended up moving in with my sponsor at about 90 days because my dad, who was living in New York at the time, was kind of done with me. I was a lot to deal with. And that was really the beginning of my sobriety. So I had a very structured thing because like my sponsor was like, what meeting did you go to? What numbers did you get? Did you call them? Who spoke? Did you share? What did they say? Like pretty much every day. And so I was accountable on a daily basis to all of that. And thank God, because I don't think I would have stayed sober otherwise. And because I lived with him, he was like, did you make your bed? Did you clean your room? Did you brush your teeth? Your parents can only give you, X amount of dollars a week, and he would talk to my family and tell them what they should and shouldn't do because they were being codependent and they should go to Al-Anon and blah, 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 blah. So like, it was a one-man recovery home that was very intense and very structured the entire time. He had a house out on the coast of New York. And I remember one time, him wanting me to clean that house, which included a 000 Brillo pad and paper towels and Windex for about 8 hours. And honestly, that really had a profound impact on me because I really understood the value of esteemable acts. Because when I got sober, I had no self-esteem. I mean, that was like I didn't even understand the word, honestly.
Right.
I was a chameleon. I was whoever I thought you wanted me to be, which was often wrong. Right. And so the integrity and the accountability and the personal responsibility that both the 12-step process and the very structured sort of behavioral process that my sponsor instilled in me really set the tone for my recovery. And, and back then in New York, in between each of those meetings I would go to on a daily basis, somebody was always asking if you wanted to go to coffee or you wanted to go have dinner. And if you didn't have money, they would pay for you. And, do you have a place to stay tonight? That was a regular occurrence.
People looked out for each other. They still do. But I think back then it was really very, very much happening. It's
a lot less now.
Right.
And look, I think there wasn't really the treatment industry as a prevalent source. And at that time, there was Betty Ford, there was Hazleton, there was a few other places around, but it wasn't a cultural norm in the recovery community that people were going to rehab or having outside support communities to rely upon to help you stay sober. And for me, I definitely would not have stayed sober if I didn't have all of those things. In hindsight, I didn't realize what grace it was to have that gift of desperation and willingness to say no to things, to say yes to things that I had always said no to. Always. I mean, you would tell me, and I was a horrible liar. Like if you said, "Oh, what color is the sky?" and you wanted me to say blue, I would say it was green. Just lies would just roll off my tongue because I had no value. I had no morals. I was kind of like this animal coming into 12-step programs, and the 12-step programs really raised me. I think because I got sober when I was 19, and other than this dark period between 5 and 10 years sober where I wasn't very active, and almost relapsed at 10 years sober, I think I've always been pretty active in 12-step community, and it has changed me to my core. I mean, I can't really explain how profoundly it's changed me to the core of my heart and my soul. And when I turned 20 years sober and 40 years old, about 13 years ago, I had this great career because of the 12-step program and learning the things I learned from my sponsor, show up and do what's in front of you. I was a really good employee, and I was able to have a great career, producing corporate events for the entertainment industry and sports. And I loved it. But ultimately, I think, the 12-step process and the 12-step community kind of ruined my ability to have a, quote unquote, normal life,
Right.
that was just about making money and having a successful career, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so when I turned 40 years old and 20 years sober, I was like, I need something more. I can't just do this career thing that I'm doing. I need to make recovery more a part of my life, but I had no idea what that was going to be.
Sure.
And, and just like when I got sober and got my first career job that got me into corporate events, it was volunteering at APLA. And the only place they had a volunteer position available was in the development department, fundraising and events. And that's how my 25-year career started. So really everything that I have and have developed in my adult life has been as a result of recovery and having a service-oriented outlook on life.
Mm-hmm.
And so probably about 5 years after that, when I turned like 25 years sober and about 45 years old, I took on this sponsee who I was landing at LAX from a trip to New York, and another sponsee called and said, you need to call this guy. He's in the hospital, and he, stole a cop car and crashed it into a Starbucks and lost both his legs, and he's in Cedars. And I was like, okay.
Wow.
I was like, that's a lot. Like, okay. And I was like, be careful what you ask God for, because he will deliver in, 100%. And so for the next year and a half, I ended up sponsoring that guy. He ended up going to the Van Ness House and about 10 or 11 other places, including Liberty House, and for 2 weeks. And, it really opened my mind to the idea of working in recovery, because helping him, in a wheelchair, and then getting prosthetics, and then, just seeing all the different modalities, I found it very attractive in a way that I'd never really been exposed to before, because I didn't get sober in a treatment environment.
Right.
So I started, volunteering at a structured recovery home, and I immediately took to it. I understood the value of all the change in behavior stuff that they were doing, because I went through that myself, but in a different way. And I understood how the 12-step philosophy, the spiritual principles behind the 12 steps, were interwoven into the recovery home process in a way that I found exciting and very compelling. And it changed me. And then there was another guy around the same time, within the first year or so of helping the guy I was sponsoring. There was another guy who I became friends with, whose partner ended up hanging himself as a result of both of their alcoholism and drug addiction, and didn't succeed, and ended up going to ICU, and he never came out of it. He became a vegetable, and they ended up pulling the plug like 2.5 years later. But with the guy I was sponsoring, ended up going to the ICU, ended up going to the recovery place that he was at, and with him and his partner, and like all of this together just like had this really deep impact on my mind and my body and my spirit, in a way that I was like, I need to be giving back in a more profound way. And so in August of 2015, me and one other person started talking about opening a nonprofit recovery home, that had a similar, long-term, 12 plus months abstinence, 12-step based behavior change philosophy. But as a nonprofit, where it didn't matter whether you had money or not, that it just mattered that you had the willingness to do whatever it would take to be able to get sober and learn how to stay sober long term,
Mm-hmm.
because that was my own lived experience. You know,
Right.
that was what got and helped me stay sober, and I really believed in it, although I had very little experience. And so previously, with the guy that I was sponsoring, one of the places he went to, Van Ness House, Kathy Watt, who is the executive director still there.
Mm-hmm.
She's like, well, if you want to work in recovery, you should go to UCLA and get involved in their addiction recovery, their KDAC program, and see if, because working in recovery and being in recovery are not the same thing.
Two different
things.
It's two different things.
It's really about. Hold on, Siri is somehow trying to. Okay, I think Siri went away. So I ended up doing the KDAC program at UCLA and got my certificate in drug and alcohol counseling. And all it did was reaffirm to me that although I loved recovery and I definitely wanted to work in recovery, I definitely did not want to work in a medical model treatment environment.
Right.
Not because there's anything wrong with it, but A, it wasn't my own lived experience, and B, I wanted something that was more focused on long-term recovery.
Sure.
But it gave me a lot of education, you know, over 300 hours of classwork and, you know, 270 hours of interning at IOP, yes. Which we still get referrals from now. But I just knew that wasn't going to be my path.
That's not what you wanted to do. Very similar to me. I went to school for all that stuff. I worked on the front lines for a while, but I had other ideas. Most definitely.
Yeah.
Most definitely. And I want to ask you this, like, did you get other ideas as far as like when you started to talk about wanting to open a nonprofit, a structured sober living? Was it because you were volunteering at the prior place and you saw the day-to-day activities that went on in there, and this is where you realized, like, I'd like to be able to open a place, but nonprofit?
Well, like I said, he went to like 10 or 11 different places in like 12 to 14 months. And so I would say all together, all the different places he ended up going to, and then talking with several other long-term structured sober livings that were in LA, all those things together made me decide that was what I definitely wanted, that I definitely wanted to do that. And then going around like, well, how do I do that? and getting a lot of help.
To do it, or did you have to find a house to get?
No, I mean, because we were a nonprofit, I ended up forming the nonprofit 501c3, then recruiting a board. My co-founder and I, co-founder was Bobby Daly Jr. And then we went on to recruit more board members, raised money, got a house, closed on it in April of 2016. Hired our first employee, which is Greg, who I know you know.
Greg is a good man.
And then we opened July 1st. And I gave up my 25-year career on June 18th of that year. So I had given notice. They understood that this was like a life mission for me. So they were very supportive and actually became a donor of the house after we ended up opening. But it was, starting any nonprofit from scratch is difficult, but we had a lot of support that made it happen.
So, question for you: when you were wanting to do all of this and you were getting funding, was it from? How are you putting your name out there as a nonprofit for people to actually contribute to be able to get it going and started?
Well, initially it was just the sober support community and our board members and their connections, and then as we were open and as people came to the house and stayed, and we did a website and all those things that you do with a startup business, we were able to start to get the word out more and do tours with people and events at board members' houses. And it was very grassroots, I would say, the way that we started out our fundraising. And then over the years, we were able to professionalize it more and make it more of a development cycle type nonprofit in terms of our fundraising.
And then when you said you closed on the house and all that, being that it's a nonprofit, was it easier to obtain a house, or did you open it as a nonprofit business, or did you have to go through the same same type of process that it would be for anybody else that wants to buy a house?
I mean, we initially had some donors that bought the house and leased it to us with an option to buy. And then they ended up donating the house to the nonprofit at the end of 2019. So now the nonprofit owns the house. But initially that wasn't, I mean, we were brand new. We didn't, like, was it going to work? Was it not going to work? Like, doing a lease with an option to buy was this kind of a smarter play initially. But now, that we're trying to get funding from larger foundations, and et cetera, owning the house is important to them, along with a lot of other criteria that are nonprofit driven.
I love that. That's so cool that they actually like bought it and donated it. But sort of like, I don't know if you know the history of Friendly House, when William Shatner, because of the way that his wife had passed away, he ended up having a house over in Cheviot Hills, and was that became one of their sober livings. And they asked him, how much do you want for rent? And he said $1 a year.
Yep.
I just love that. I love shit like that. It's so awesome. Cool. So you opened up in 2015, was it officially, or 2016?
We opened up in July of 2016.
2016. Okay. And
so we just celebrated 5 years in operation in July. Congratulations.
5 good years. And as I was telling you before we even started the podcast, as you and I both know, I'm really big, just like you, on structured sober livings. We don't have enough of them, not in Los Angeles, not in Southern California, not nationally. And it's my dream, truly, and I say this because I don't do this podcast to really advertise for my sober livings, and a lot of people that like listen to the podcast probably even know, but I do have 3 sober livings, and like, it's my dream if I had a lot of money, or even now you're giving me ideas to start some nonprofit stuff, I would create these homes up and down the coast, if not nationally, because we need more of them. I've gone around the country. I've studied the Oxford houses. I've checked out many different types of sober living environments. I know what a flop house is. I know what a place without structure is. I know what a weed-friendly place is, which to me, that's really not a sober living. It's just a place where people are smoking weed inside of a house, right? And paying money for a bed. So it's not real recovery, not in my book. So, and then a lot of people have no idea when we talk about structured sober living, what the basis is of structure. Like what exactly does the structure consist of? Why is it a good place for people to send their loved one that's perhaps gone to countless treatment centers, or been homeless, or doesn't have the means to go to a sober living? What's the beneficial aspects of going to a structured sober living? Tell us about Awakening and what the structure consists of, please.
I mean, for me, I think the most important aspects of it is community and connection. And everything that we do is built off those 2 principles. I think because we're 12-step driven, abstinence-based, and have a lot of emphasis on changing behavior sober so that it sticks over time.
Right.
That what's great is that it's interesting. My therapist said that the 12 steps were one of the best distillations of CBT that he had ever seen. Sure. And he's been practicing for 40 years, has about 39 years sober himself. And, right. And I agree, because if just talking was enough to for people to get sober, like real alcoholics and drug addicts who have seen a lot of consequences, I think, the 12 steps wouldn't exist. But it's about, your thinking. If you believe in the disease model, then the disease is centered in your mind. Mm-hmm. But the solution is action driven, and that I believe, which I think not being a clinical modality gives me the freedom to talk about it more, that, it is a allergy of the body, an obsession of the mind, and I believe a soul sickness. And I believe all 3 of those things are equally important to address in recovery, because I do believe that we are, spirits living in these bodies. And so to deny the spirit part is denying probably the most important part of who we are. Mm-hmm. And so, for me, Awakening Recovery needed to blend the 12-step process with a behavior change process in a family environment that is peer mentoring driven over a long period of time, over at least a 12-month period of time.
Who's the peers that mentor? Are they graduates? Are they alumni? Are they people that have gone through other structured homes, or just people that are in the recovery community? Is it all of it, or it's some of those?
It's literally all of those things, for sure. And I think now that we've been around 5 years, I think our own alumni play the biggest part, but that wasn't always true. And I think that, anybody who has a lived experience that would be in, unison and run parallel to what we do, like, we're happy to have them, we have friends of the house that that come to our peer mentoring house meetings, and that sponsor guys as well as alumni and people that have graduated other structured houses that are similar, because for me, the lived experience in the 12-step process, the lived experience of having been in a structured sober living,
yes,
are equally important in our environment, because it is you're really creating a family system in a long-term recovery home.
Mm-hmm.
And so all the family system issues that the guys in the house have, which are many, because I would say the predominant population that we get are people with a lot of trauma,
sure,
and co-occurring mental health issues. Mm-hmm. They need to be primary substance use, SUD or AUD to be in the house. Sure. If their primary is mental health, that's beyond our scope, because we are a purely peer mentoring driven process. We don't have any clinical.
There's no clinical involvement
support in the house. As we do refer people to clinical processes if they need it, but yes, it's not a part of our process. So, and in some ways, guys prefer that, because, like we were talking about before we started, a lot of the guys in the house they've been to 10, 15, 20 other treatment episodes, whether it was detox, residential, IOP, MAT, combinations of those things that they, for whatever reasons or combination of reasons, couldn't stay sober.
Right. So, okay, as far as when you say family system, you're not talking about their personal family life. You're talking about the family system that's created within this new environment, correct? Is that what you mean?
Exactly. And so I believe it's a family disease, and so we do have a peer mentoring house meeting that is for families, whatever that means for the resident, if it's their biological families or whatever they call family, and they support their recovery every 2 weeks. We do that. And we do have a lot of alumni family members who go to Al-Anon, who have been through our recovery home process, to mentor the families of the people that are in the house, because some of them don't even really understand what codependency is, for instance, or how their family trauma impacts their loved one's recovery. And so to try to involve them whenever possible in the process all the way through, we do try to do that, because then when they graduate and leave and live independently, they're going to be fully engaged in an unfettered way with that family of origin. And do they have the tools to be able to cope with that sober? Have they, in their 12-step process, if they have a co-occurring, mental health issue that they're starting to treat outside of the house, what are those combination of things that will give them the tools to be able to have a romantic relationship, have a supportive, compassionate, and forgiving relationship with their families, be able to work for a day's pay, that with integrity. All of those things are the skills, I think, in a microcosm way, they learn in the house.
So, okay, I love it. Very well. You said they have to have primary substance abuse. So mental health is also accepted as long as they are stabilized. So does that mean that you allow medications?
As long as they're not narcotic, yes.
Okay.
Because we are a 12-step based house and an abstinence based house, and it's very behavior change driven. It's not, our environment is not conducive to people who are on stimulant or sedative medication to the point where they can't participate in what we do on a daily basis. It wouldn't be fair to them, and it wouldn't be fair to the house to have somebody who can't participate, as an equal member of the house. And so as long as it's not narcotic, then we're good with, mood stabilizers, antidepressants.
Yep.
Not an issue.
So that brings me to the question of, brace yourself, Dave. Suboxone maintenance. Obviously, because you're a nonprofit and because you do, I think you'd mentioned, depend on some kind of funding from SAMHSA and things like that. Being a 12-step based house, do you allow your residents, I don't know what you call them, I call them residents because they're not clients in our homes, but do you allow your residents to come in on sub-maintenance, Sublocade, Suboxone, or at least perhaps if they're on it, be tapering down through a doctor's orders, or do they have to be completely abstinent 100% when they come in?
So we ask that all residents that come in be weaned off buprenorphine or methadone-based MAT, or stimulant or benzo-based MAT, and no THC as well. And so, for instance, we've had guys come in on Vivitrol shots, which has no partial opiates in it, and
Sure.
We're good with that. But not the other stuff, for the same reason, really, that I said before. It doesn't allow them to fully participate in the same way that everybody else is. And it, that's what the family that lives there has agreed to.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I don't have anything against MAT. I think, harm reduction can be a very important part of, the readiness to change scale. But Sure. We are more with people who are interested in, maintenance of their recovery than a harm reduction approach. And look, I think, naloxone saves lives, and MAT can help people get ready for, abstinence-based recovery. But because our recovery home is abstinence and 12-step based, buprenorphine and methadone-based MAT isn't conducive to our environment.
Agreed 100%. We're on the same page. I mean, that's just my outlook. I get a lot of criticism for having that outlook. I just say, listen, this is my experience. This is what I believe in. I do believe in harm reduction. I don't believe in long-term, maintenance. I think that people are being robbed of the opportunity to actually seek recovery when they're still, I don't like to use the word Band-Aid, but sometimes I do. When they're still on long-term maintenance through subs, through buprenorphine. So then if someone is absolutely in need of coming to a place like yours, like Awakening, how do you determine if they're a good fit? Because obviously, is there a screening process? Does there have to be a level of willingness on the residents, possible future residents want to come in? Or obviously it's not the parents that can decide. And how do you guys decide if this person is good for our culture and our environment?
One other thing about the MAT thing, I think the other thing that's problematic about it is that most of the guys that come into our house, and I don't think it's unique to just our house, are polysubstance addicted.
Yes.
And a lot of times the polysubstance addiction is stimulants and opiates.
Sure.
And there isn't yet, although they're working on it, an effective medically assisted treatment for methamphetamine, for instance.
Yes.
And so it doesn't help to address that piece of it, which I think is unfortunate. So I think we're a good alternative, for people who want to be in abstinence 12-step based recovery, that, if they're dually addicted, with opiates and stimulants. I think the MAT approach currently is tough because there's a lot of ways to game the system. And like we had one guy in the house that, had been trying to get off MAT, buprenorphine based MAT for 7 years. And he was like smoking crack and doing cocaine and meth in between the testing things. And he was gaming the system. And it was just another drug for him. And it takes 3 weeks sometimes to detox off of buprenorphine based MAT. With methadone, it can be longer, and so, and people do become addicted to it, I think in the latest study I saw that, buprenorphine was the most misused of the, prescription drugs. So I don't know how that can be a long-term recovery solution, I guess is my point. And look, I think there's some people who've been using heroin for 20, 30 years. They're in their 50s and they're,
Sure.
And their pleasure receptors in their brain might be long-term or permanently damaged in a way where they're going to need some sort of medication assistance to be able to function in life in recovery. But that's like 1%, and it's certainly not anywhere almost ever relevant in the 18 to 32-year-old range, which is most of the people that come into our house. And so I just wanted to sort of extend my thought about this. In terms of screening, yes, we did. I think the primary criteria is that we think they're a good fit and that they think they're a good fit. We don't hide the fact that, it's a year-plus long 12-step abstinence-based process. We don't hide the fact that you're not going to have a cell phone or be working until you finish a 4th and 5th step, which usually is at least 4 to 6 months into being in the house. So we say
that's part of the rules too, right?
Yes. And so we say that.
I applaud you, sir.
On the first call, like the first screening call, we weed out 80 to 90% of the people who really just aren't interested in that. In that first phone call, just for saying the things that I just said. And so it's because look, we're not, again, not that there's anything wrong with the internet and not that there's anything wring with working in early recovery, but for our environment and with what we do, which is very rigorous,
right?
It doesn't work, honestly. And we don't want to really, turn somebody loose onto the work environment or to having a smartphone with unlimited access to social media and, chat rooms, et cetera, until they have some understanding of who they are. And until they finish a 4th and 5th step and understand the causes and conditions behind their addiction and alcoholism, they don't really know that. And so they're much more vulnerable to triggers and relapse situations before they do a 4th and 5th step. So it's our way. We think it's actually the easier, softer way to do that. But some people don't. And if they don't, that's cool, but then they're not a good fit for our house.
I love it. And this is why when Leah actually reached out to me to talk about having you come on this podcast, I told her I'm a fan of Awakening. You guys don't know, but I've been studying you guys from a distance, and I know Greg. And Greg's a very good man. He's the program director there. No,
he's our director of operations, and he's been there since he was our first employee, and he was there 3 months before we opened the house, helping us get ready to open the house, and he's been instrumental in our success.
You guys do good work, and I just want you to know, I've actually probably sent some people your way, that especially people that didn't have the means, knowing that you guys are nonprofit, but can still provide the very structured type of environment that other people charge $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 a bed for in the greater Los Angeles area. I mean, that's usually when you want structure in that type of setting in LA, you're going to have to pay for it. And so this is great. I mean, I have an immense amount of respect for what you're doing. We need we really need more of this. And with all things considered, between the HOA trying to, run you guys out and you guys fighting that case and winning the case and them paying your legal fees, I fucking love that. That's awesome because if you don't know, I'm going to just bring this up right now. Down in Orange County, there are certain cities that have created ordinances within their cities, which are totally going against the federal, Fair Housing Act. and they're winning. There's actually one city that won and was able to push out any type of, and it got really saturated down there because of certain treatment centers that had sober livings attached to them and whatnot. But now all the other cities are following suit because that one particular city won. And it's like, what the hell are you going to do when you got all these people that have gone to countless treatment centers or that are coming from across America to treatment out in California, and they're going to get discharged and they get the taste of California life and they want to be near the beach rather than in fucking Kentucky or some shit. And now they're not going to have homes to go to. It's like, I'm actually meeting with some people tomorrow who we're going up against them, and we're going to do whatever we can in order to be able to function as a place that's a safe environment, and if we do whatever it takes, right? And I love that you have this going on. I told you earlier I want to come and check out Awakening. I've been telling Greg for a few years now I want to come and tour, and I really should make the time because it's in my neighborhood in LA. It's like, because we're in Beverly Wood. I didn't even know that. I thought you were like up in the hills or something like that, but it's all good. I mean, still. So, wow.
Yeah. I mean, look, just to clarify that the HOA wasn't trying to run us out, but they were trying to
make things hard, make things difficult.
Make part of their CC&Rs an illegal screening process.
Okay.
And so we mediated with them to find something, because look, NIMBYs, not in my backyard issues, are not totally foundless. There are a lot of bad actors out there
Sure.
that make it hard for the good actors like us to,
Right.
to exist. And so we weren't trying to do anything other than create an even playing field within our HOA, which has like 1,300 homes in it.
Yes.
So that no one was being discriminated against. I think that was really our biggest issue with that. But yes, I think Orange County, unfortunately, they have, a lot of stuff that is not, good. And I wish that wasn't the case, but I think, I'd love to be a part of whatever it is you're doing, because, however we can advocate to create a fair, safe space for people who want peer mentoring, social model recovery, in a residential environment. Because look, could we do what we do in a commercial environment? Sure. But if we're trying to repair family systems,
it wouldn't work in a commercial
foster long-term recovery,
right.
The best place to do that is in a residential environment, so that you are seeing it that way.
Sure. The only place I've actually seen it work commercially is in a commercial environment was I went up to see the John Volcom Academy up in Washington State, and they actually housed their residents inside of a building that they built out in like kind of dorm style, and then the building next door was sort of the place where they did not their clinical work, but like a lot of the work that they did, and that was impressive. I was very impressed. But now they have a lot of different homes too, like in Arizona, and they just opened up recently down in Santa Cruz too.
And look, our neighbors love us. Like, we clean the street every day. We help people move stuff around their houses if they need to. We have rules for our residents as they walk through the neighborhood, so they're not smoking or wearing inappropriate clothing or making loud noises. And because we don't want to create a bigger footprint than any other residential house in the HOA. Sure. And we do a lot of hard work to ensure that.
And I believe that type of, it doesn't just have to come from the house manager teaching them this is the way we conduct ourselves. That comes from the structure within the house that they're learning to redevelop and change who they are. They don't need to be hip, slick, and cool and flicking cigarettes and spitting in the street and being exactly what NIMBY would zero in on. I think that we become actually, truly, if you have the structures that's within certain houses, we become one of the safest houses on the block. It's not about, oh my God, those drug addicts those are the guys that are not doing drugs, as opposed to down the street, somebody could be doing fentanyl right in your very own home. Right. So
look, the community piece is huge, in our process. And I think part of building community is being a part of the community that the house is in, and all our guys that graduate, they commit to moving out with another graduating resident for at least another year, because once they go into independent living, which they've saved up money from working to do, independently, that is a huge part of what we do. And the guys that graduate are also sponsor the guys in their house and their 12-step issues. They lead peer mentoring house meetings in the house, and they're as our alumni are as much a part of our community as our residents. And in a lot of ways, as you know, in years 2 to 5, at least, if not beyond,
sure,
living is harder in certain ways than when you have the structure of the house to support you. Being able to do it on your own and live a service-based sober life is not an easy thing to do. So we, especially in the last few years, since we've had more alumni now, going into our 6th year now, that's a huge part of what we do. And we do a monthly now alumni check-in meeting where our alumni come to the house, and I help lead that. And it's really about how are you taking all the other slices of the pie in your life and balancing it with your recovery now that you're living independently, have a girlfriend, have had a kid, are getting married, have a job, have challenging family issues. All those things, those are hard things to deal with in recovery, certainly in the earlier years. And so to me, that's just as important as what we do in the first year with our residents.
I love it. This has been excellent. You're speaking my language. I actually, my wheels are spinning in my head. I want to be able to collaborate with you. I think that you and I need to meet more and talk more about, future projects. I want to introduce you to Earl. Earl would love Awakening. If he knows more about this, he needs to know about Awakening.
I've heard Earl. He's a great speaker, and I respect a lot with the work he does.
Sure. I appreciate you and just being on the podcast today. You're a good man. You're doing very good work. I commend you. I'm a fan of Awakening. I'm going to set something up with you and Greg, and come on down, and perhaps we could go have lunch and kind of just throw some ideas around. And I want to involve you in the thing that I'm going to be going to tomorrow too. So I'll tell you more about that.
That's great. Yeah. And one more thing, I just want to let you know, we are planning on opening a women's house in the first half of next year. And we really think as much as what we do is needed for men, it is even more needed for women. And so we are deep in the process of doing that. And we anticipate opening in the first half of 2022 for women. That's
why I opened a house that was co-ed at first. I really wasn't a fan of the idea of co-ed, but I had a female that was supposed to, it was a female identifying as a male that was supposed to move in, and I could not have, it was going to be just a men's house. I couldn't have that because he still had female parts, and how are you going to test, UA? So turns out that person barely stayed with us, but in that time I opened a female division on one side, and it worked. It worked. I mean, everybody's got sponsors. They're all working steps. There's a lot of peer mentoring. I mean, it works. So we need more homes that'll accommodate females too, because Lord knows a lot of them are suffering out there, and it's hard to get into certain places. So you're doing great work. I respect you so much, and thank you for being on today. And off the air, you and I will be in communication. All right.
That's great. Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.
Coming to the corner. Talk to you soon.
Right. Take care. Bye-bye.